The horn was inside the shack with me. That's the only way I can describe it, not outside, not rolling down from the tunnel like before. It was inside, rattling the aluminum walls of the security office from within, filling the room with a low, groaning wail that pressed against the undersides of my eardrums like thumbs. I was pressed into the corner behind the filing cabinet. The desk lamp had swung on its hinge until it pointed at the ceiling, throwing the whole room into jagged, tilted light. The paper, both sheets, typed and handwritten. They had blown off the desk even though there was no wind in there, no open window, no reason at all. The glass on the exterior window had begun to fog from the inside. Something was tracing letters on it. From the inside, I remember thinking with remarkable calm, it's been in here the whole time, and it was never outside. And then I saw Marcus through the glass, standing on the gravel outside, staring in, soaked to the skin, that look on his face, and not fear, nothing as simple as fear, but recognition, like watching someone make the exact mistake he'd made. He pressed one hand flat to the outside of the glass. His fingers didn't fog it, because he was already on the other side, 3 nights before that. I'm going to be honest about something before any of this makes sense. I'm not an honest person. That's not self-deprecation. It's a fact I've had 2 years to sit with, and I've gotten comfortable enough with it that I can state it plainly without flinching. Not a pathological liar. I don't enjoy it. I don't do it for sport. I'm the quieter kind of dishonest, the kind who fills in paperwork with the answers that keep things moving. I'm the kind who looks at a relay junction that hasn't been replaced and writes replaced because it's the end of a double shift, and there's another inspection at 6 in the morning and nobody's going to check before then anyway. His name was Paul Guerrera. He was the engineer on the overnight freight run 3 days after I signed that inspection report. The braking failure they traced back through 5 layers of documentation until they found my signature at the bottom of a line that said signal relay, replaced and certified. He survived the initial derailment. He died in the hospital 11 days later from a spinal injury sustained in the cab. I know the exact shape of the decision I made. I've measured its dimensions carefully. I carry it the way you carry a stone in a coat pocket, always aware of the weight and the way it shifts when you move. So when the contractor's rep offered me the night watchman position at the Caldwell Freight Terminal on the outskirts of Harrow Junction, I didn't ask about the work history of the place. Didn't ask why they needed a human watchman at all for what was officially listed as a decommissioned property. Didn't ask why the pay was 20% above market for a job that required nothing more than remaining awake and patrolling 8 acres of dead rail yard. I needed something quiet, something I couldn't damage. The rep was a woman named Sandra who wore a lanyard from a corporate security firm called Gray Vein Logistics. She met me at the main gate on a Tuesday evening, unlocked the padlock on the chain link entrance, and handed me a manila envelope. "Shift starts at 11, she said, ends at 7. Standard stuff." Inside the envelope was a typed sheet on white paper with the Gray Vein header at the top. Bold text centered on the first line, "Night Supervisor Yard Safety Protocols. Rule 1, never step onto track 7 after midnight. Rule 2, if you hear a train horn, remain inside the security office until it ceases. Rule 3, if signal lights activate, do not attempt to reset them under any circumstance. Rule 4, if you see a train in the yard, assume you are mistaken and document the observation for review." Sandra was already walking back to her car. I read the sheet twice. "Hey," I called, "what's track 7? She glanced over her shoulder. "It's marked." "Why shouldn't I go on it?" "It's decommissioned," she said. "Your structural integrity on the rail bed hasn't been assessed." "And the train horn," she paused with her hand on the car door. Her expression was difficult to read, something between tired and deliberately neutral. Old terminals sometimes carry sound from active lines nearby. It can be disorienting. She left. I stood at the gate for a minute, listening to the gravel settle under her tires as she pulled away. Then I turned and faced the yard for the first time. The Caldwell terminal was larger than it had looked in the contractor's documentation. The main switching grid ran east to west across the center of the property. 8 parallel tracks of varying length, their steel rails dull and rust-spotted, the wooden ties between them swollen from moisture and time. Loading platforms ran the length of the northern border, in their concrete edges cracked and colonized by weeds. A cluster of maintenance sheds occupied the southern end, their corrugated metal walls blistered with old paint. And at the far eastern edge of the property, past where the other tracks ended, a single line extended alone toward the tree line, longer than the others, straight as a ruled line drawn on the earth. Track 7. It ran into a concrete tunnel portal embedded in the hillside. The entrance was sealed, a heavy timber and metal bulkhead bolted across the opening, closed signage, weathered orange caution tape that had mostly peeled away. A faded placard on the hillside above the portal read, Caldwell East Extension, closed by order of State Rail Authority. Structural hazard. I filed that away and walked to the security shack. It was a low, prefabricated structure near the main gate. Inside, a desk, a space heater, a logbook, a mostly static radio, and a bank of 4 black and white security monitors that showed various corners of the yard in greenish night vision grain. The monitors were on. The images were stable. I sat down and opened the logbook. The last entry was dated 14 months ago. Shift complete, no incidents. The handwriting was small and neat. It was when I opened the center desk drawer to look for a pen that I found the second sheet, not typed. Handwritten on a piece of notebook paper, edges soft from age. No header, no logo, just rules. Rule 1. Track 7 is the only safe track after midnight. Rule 2. If you hear a train horn, go outside immediately. Rule 3. Reset any signal lights that activate. Do not wait. Rule 4. If you see a train in the yard, do not look away under any circumstances. I laid both sheets on the desk side by side, read them again, read them a third time. The same subject matter, organized into the same numbered format, contradict each other on every single point. I want to tell you that my rational mind immediately generated sensible explanations. Outdated protocols being superseded by current ones. Different zones of the property have different standards. A prank. Residual paperwork from a former tenant. I considered all of those. And then I looked at the security monitors. In the bottom right screen of the camera covering the eastern end of the yard, nearest track 7. Something was slightly wrong with the image. Not wrong in a way I could immediately name. More like a visual texture problem, a frame rate anomaly. And the rails in that corner of the screen seemed to catch light that wasn't coming from anywhere visible. A dull silver shimmer, intermittent, as though something reflective was barely in motion just out of frame. I put both rule sheets in the desk drawer and left them there. I told myself I would sort it out in the morning. I told myself a lot of things that first night. The yard is not an easy place to describe. I've tried a few times since, to myself mostly in the margins of the logbook when there was nothing else to do. And I keep running up against the same problem. The sensory facts are simple enough. Gravel underfoot. Wind through busted signal housings. The smell of rust and old machine oil that never entirely left the ground, 20 years after the last locomotive passed through. All of that is straightforward. What's hard to describe is the quality of the space between things. Rail yards are designed around negative space, the gaps between tracks, the open corridors between sheds, the long, empty stretches between one platform and the next. Most industrial spaces feel dense with function even when they're empty, residual purposefulness still embedded in the architecture. Caldwell felt different. It felt like a place that had been carefully emptied, like someone had removed not just the people and the machines, but something more fundamental. Some connective tissue between moments. And what remained was a sequence of locations that didn't quite add up to a coherent place. I noticed it first during my patrol route on the second night. The route was simple. From the shack to the main switching grid, along the platform border, down through the maintenance sheds, back along the southern fence line, and home. About 40 minutes at a reasonable pace. I'd timed it twice to be sure. Except on the second night, the maintenance sheds took longer than they should have. I entered through the northern access door, a large rolling panel that had been left partially open, fixed in place by rust, and I walked the length of the shed interior the way I had the night before. Long, concrete-floored space, tool bays on either side, all empty. Overhead track for a chain hoist, the chain hanging coiled and still. At the far end, the southern exit, 40 seconds, maybe 50. But when I came out the southern exit and checked my watch, 11 minutes had passed. I stood in the gravel lot and stared at the shed for a moment. The building wasn't more than 60 feet long, and there was no way I had spent 11 minutes inside it. I went back in, walked it again, checked every bay, nothing unusual, nothing hidden, no second corridor or room I'd missed. 42 seconds. On the third traversal, 41 seconds. Normal. I wrote it off. Fatigue math, I told myself. The brain does strange things with time in sensory-deprived environments. But then there was the matter of the signal tower. It stood at the center of the main switching grid, a steel-frame structure about 30 feet high, topped with a signal array that would have governed train traffic across all 8 tracks when the terminal was active. The power infrastructure had been disconnected when the yard was decommissioned. I'd confirmed this on the first night. The conduit running from the tower base to the main terminal box had been cut, and the severed ends capped with weatherproof covers. No electrical connection. At 2:17 in the morning on my third shift, the signal lights came on. I was inside the shack. The monitors caught it first, a bloom of color in the camera covering the switching grid, washing out the night vision image. I looked up from the logbook and through the shack window, and I could see them directly. The red, yellow, and green arrays running in sequence across all 4 faces of the tower, cycling through their signals as if the yard were live, as if trains were inbound and waiting on the lines. The typed rule sheet said, "Do not attempt to reset them under any circumstances." The handwritten sheet said, "Reset any signal lights that activate. Do not wait." I sat and watched them cycle. Red, yellow, green, pause. Red, yellow, green, pause. And they ran for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I timed it on my watch, this time paying attention. Then they went dark, and in the silence after, before the wind came back, before the loose metal somewhere in the maintenance shed started its low rhythmic banging again, I heard it. Faint, low frequency, unmistakable, the rolling of steel wheels on steel track, not loud enough to be certain of, not loud enough to point to. A sound at the very edge of the audible range where sound and vibration blur into a single bodily sensation. Something you feel in your molars before you hear it with your ears. I pressed my palm flat to the desk surface. The wood was vibrating. Very slightly, very steadily. I sat there with my hand on the desk and my eyes on the monitor covering track 7, watching that odd light shimmer in the image, and I thought about Paul Guerrera in the hospital bed. I thought about the shape of my own signature at the bottom of the inspection report. I thought about 11 days. I thought I deserved to be frightened here. And then I thought, but what exactly is here? Because the shimmer in the monitor I was only now noticing and was directional. Whatever caused it was moving, slowly, coming from the direction of the sealed tunnel, moving down track 7 toward the main yard. The maintenance shed was his. I understood that immediately when I saw him, the way someone occupies a space they've gotten used to. The specific ease of a man who has established the locations of his coffee cup and his spare flashlight and his place to sit when his knees ache. Marcus wore it on his body the way the shed wore it in its walls. He belonged there, and it was the 4th night. I was doing my patrol circuit and I had just passed the rolling door of the central maintenance shed when a light appeared inside. Not from overhead, but from a lantern sitting on one of the empty workbenches. And I stopped. The shed had been dark every other night. I stood in the doorway and said with the very specific composure of a man who has decided he will not react visibly to frightening things. "Hello?" He came from the far end of the shed from beyond the hoist track, stepping around a support column with a flashlight held at his hip. He was older, late 50s, maybe 60. Gray beard gone ragged at the edges. A heavy canvas jacket with a rail company logo on the breast pocket, the logo too faded to read. He moved the way older men with bad joints move, deliberately, no wasted motion, every step tested before weight was committed. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as mild startlement, quickly resettling into resignation. "Didn't know they'd assigned another one," he said. "I've been here 4 nights, I said. Something crossed his face at that. Not disbelief exactly. More like a man recalculating a figure he'd thought was settled. 4 nights, he repeated. Marcus Webb. He offered his hand and I shook it. Solid grip, warm hand, completely undeniably physical. Started here about 6 weeks back. Daniel Reyes. Who hired you on? Gravane Logistics. A woman named Sandra. He made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a word, a dismissive sound. I was hired through the State Property Management Office, he said. Direct contract. You don't know any Gravane. I pulled the typed rule sheet from my jacket pocket. It had been living there since the 2nd night. I'd started carrying both sheets on patrol without quite deciding to. You know these protocols? He took the sheet and read it. His expression shifted through several calibrations, none of them reassuring. He handed it back. That one's wrong, he said simply. He reached into his own jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. Handwritten. I unfolded it already knowing what I would find. The same 4 rules in a similar hand, aged in a similar way to the sheet I'd found in the desk drawer. These are the rules, he said. Track 7 is the only safe track after dark. You hear the horn, you go outside to the rail, you see the signals light up. You reset them before they cycle through. You've got maybe 2 minutes to get up the ladder before they lock in. And if you see the train, you don't look away, I finished. He looked at me sharply. Found the same sheet in the desk drawer, I told him. And the other one? He nodded at the typed corporate document still in my hand. Where'd that come from? They gave it to me at orientation. He was quiet for a moment. The lantern on the workbench put half his face in warm light and left the other half to shadow. And I noticed that the shadow side seemed deeper than it should be, as though the light couldn't penetrate that particular angle of darkness. Someone gave you instructions designed to get you killed, he said finally. Or someone gave you instructions that are wrong, I said. Here, and you've been operating on bad information for 6 weeks. We looked at each other with the specific mutual assessment of 2 people who have each decided the other might be lying. Except it wasn't quite that. It was more uncomfortable than that, because we both had rule sheets. Because we'd both been assigned to the same property through different channels that had never communicated with each other. because neither of us had evidence beyond our own experience. And experience, I was already beginning to understand that it was not a reliable currency in this particular yard. "Have you seen it?" I asked. "The train?" He was quiet again. Much longer this time. "Yes," he said. "What does it look like?" He picked up his lantern from the workbench and turned toward the shed's far exit. "Like a train that's trying to remember how to be real," he said. "That's the closest I can get." He paused in the doorway, backlit by the yard's ambient dark. "Stay away from track 7 tonight, Daniel. Whatever that sheet says, until we understand this better." And then he was outside, and I was standing alone in the maintenance shed with two contradictory rule sheets and the particular cold feeling of a man who has just realized he's been operating without sufficient information inside a situation with lethal potential. That feeling, I want to note, was not entirely unfamiliar to me. I told myself it was an experiment. That's the self-serving framing I've kept returning to when I try to reconstruct the fifth night. And the official story I tell myself is that I stayed inside the shack because I was performing a controlled test, seeing which set of rules produced which outcomes, gathering evidence. The truth, which I have the benefit of 2 years of honest reflection to acknowledge, is that I was afraid to go outside. That my body had already decided the shack walls were a boundary the thing in the yard would respect, and all my rationalization about experimental methodology was just the brain furnishing an explanation the body had already reached on its own. The horn sounded at 3:14. It wasn't like the distant vibration I'd heard before, the sound felt through wood surfaces phenomenon that I'd almost been able to dismiss. This was sound, unambiguous, physical, moving air, a single long, low note that rolled across the yard from the direction of the sealed tunnel and arrived at the shack walls with enough substance to rattle the window in its frame. The typed rule sheet said, "Remain inside until it ceases." The handwritten sheet said, "Go outside immediately." Marcus was in the yard. I know that now. He had emerged from the maintenance shed the moment the horn sounded. I can reconstruct the timeline from what I observed through the monitor window, though the camera covering the eastern shed was malfunctioning that night, its image dropping in and out in stuttering intervals. On one frame, he wasn't visible. On the next, he was already moving toward the eastern end of the yard. On the frame after that, the camera dropped entirely and stayed black. I watched through the shack window. He was a shape in the dark at first, his flashlight off, moving by the ambient light of the overcast sky. I could track him by the sound of his boots on the gravel until he reached the track bed, and the gravel gave way to the silence of the rail ties. The signal tower came alive, all green this time, no cycling through the sequence. Directly to green, all faces simultaneous, and they held. Marcus stopped at the edge of track 7. I could see him clearly enough from the shack. The distance between us was perhaps 200 feet. He stood with his weight forward, his head up, looking toward the tunnel. And then the tunnel answered him. The headlight appeared first. A single white point deep inside the sealed portal. Impossible because the portal was sealed, each because there was nothing behind that bulkhead but collapsed earth and 20-year-old wreckage and 30 dead men's bones. The white point grew, brightening with the consistency of an approaching train, but not at train speed. Slower, deliberate, like something being careful about its own materialization. The locomotive emerged from the tunnel wall, not through the bulkhead, through the wall beside the bulkhead, through the hillside itself, through solid earth and rock, as though the earth were a projection and the train were the only real thing. But it wasn't fully material. I struggle to describe this accurately. The front of the locomotive was solid enough to catch the ambient light and throw shadows, but the body of it faded as it extended backward, the steel and iron becoming translucent and then transparent. the superstructure dissolving into a pattern of fog and oily darkness through which I could see the tree line. Half a train, half real. It moved out of the hillside and onto track 7 at a slow, predatory roll, and it was massive in a way that functioning photographs of locomotives never quite convey. The sheer vertical scale of it, the dense, indifferent weight of all that metal. Marcus stood on the track and didn't move. I understood then that he had seen this before. The quality of his stillness was recognition, not paralysis. He was observing it, doing what his rule sheet told him to do. But something was different this time. The train was faster, not much, but measurably. The headlight, which had been growing at a calm and deliberate rate, was now growing with urgency, and the half-material quality of the locomotive was changing. The translucent sections becoming more solid, as though the thing were pulling more of itself into this version of the world with each passing second. Marcus turned. Not slowly. He spun on his heel with a sudden, desperate motion, and I saw his mouth open and I heard him scream across 200 feet of dead rail yard. Not words, just the pure tonal output of a man who has realized too late that a situation has changed its rules on him. He ran. He was running when the train reached him, or passed through him. I can't say with certainty which it was. The image I have in my memory is of Marcus disappearing into the fog of the locomotive's dissolving rear section, and then the train continuing down track 7, and then the train fading, the headlight going out, and the metal geometry of it bleeding back into darkness until the yard was empty and silent again under the all-green signals. Marcus's flashlight was on the track bed, still on, pointing at the hillside. He was not. I did not sleep. I sat in the shack until the sky grayed at the edges and waited for something to tell me what to do. Nothing obliged. At 6:50 in the morning, I walked to the terminal office, a larger prefabricated building near the main gate that I'd used only to check the utilities panel. And I went through it methodically, drawer by drawer, shelf by shelf, looking for anything that would give me a framework to reason inside. Most of what I found was administrative debris. Old invoices, maintenance schedules from the terminal's operating years, copies of safety filings. In the bottom drawer of a steel locker in the back room behind a set of folded high-visibility vests, I found the journal. It was a standard supervisor's field journal. Spiral-bound green cover, property of the Caldwell terminal, dated beginning 23 years ago. The entries were in several hands, different supervisors recording different shifts, and most of it was mundane. Weather, personnel notes, mechanical status. Standard yard ops documentation. The tone changed about 2/3 of the way through. About 18 months before the terminal's official closure date, a supervisor named Elliot Marsh started noting anomalies. Signal light activations with no power source. Sounds from the eastern end of the yard, and a time irregularity in the maintenance sheds, his words, where workers lost significant minutes they couldn't account for. A foreman who reported seeing a train on track 7 from a second-story window was sent home on psychiatric grounds. Then the tunnel collapse was recorded. Not the official version which I'd read in the State Rail Authority records described a soil destabilization event triggered by a wet spring. Elliot Marsh's version was different. Marsh described a train, the Caldwell East Limited, a freight consist running the overnight route, entering the eastern tunnel at standard speed and not emerging on the other end as it should have 14 minutes later. When the tunnel entrance was investigated, the portal structure showed signs of catastrophic stress on the interior faces. Stress that moved from the inside outward, not from the external hillside inward. As though something inside the tunnel had pushed against the earth. The tunnel didn't collapse on the train. The train tried to come back through 30 crew members. The derailment in the tunnel, triggered by what exactly was never determined, killed them. The death records were public. I had no reason to doubt them. But Marsh's last entries described something that the official documentation had entirely omitted. He described the yard as split, not physically, not a visible divide, but he described a consistent pattern. Events on the western side of the yard behaved normally, conformed to known physics, and responded to rational intervention. Events on the eastern end, near track 7 near the tunnel, did not. They repeated. They varied. They seemed to exist, he wrote, in two overlapping states simultaneously, and which state you observed appeared to depend on where you were standing and what you were expecting to see. I have come to believe, Marsh wrote in the final dated entry, that the accident produced a local fracture in sequential time, anchored at the point of initial derailment inside the tunnel. The train continues to try to complete its route. In one version of this yard it failed and stopped. In another version it did not. And below that, in different ink, as though written later, track 7 is the seam between them. The rules are not safety protocols, they are instructions for choosing which version you inhabit. And the last line on the last page was written in handwriting that was hurried and cramped, pressed into the paper with more force than the other entries. Whatever you do, don't let it see you undecided. It interprets hesitation as an invitation. The 6th night I laid both rule sheets on the desk, turned the desk lamp on them, and looked at them for a long time. I want to be precise about my mental state because I think precision matters here. I was frightened. That goes without saying, and I won't insult either of us by dwelling on it. But I was also something more specific than frightened. Something that I think only people who have spent time on the wrong side of a moral ledger will recognize. I was frightened in a way that felt appropriate, calibrated, like the universe had finally caught up to a debt I'd been carrying and presented the bill in the only currency that made sense given the amount. Paul Guerrera. 11 days. I kept thinking about the 2 rule sheets and what Marsh had written. Instructions for choosing which version you inhabit. If that was true, if the rules weren't about survival but about navigation, then what had happened to Marcus was not simply that he'd followed the wrong instructions. He had crossed into one version of the year and I had stayed in another, and the train that passed through him had been fully real in his version, and now he was somewhere in the architecture of this fractured place, occupying a reality I hadn't yet found. At 10 minutes past midnight, the shack window fogged, not from outside, from inside the GLA, and the condensation formed on the interior surface, which made no thermodynamic sense. And in the fog, drawn by a finger I could not see attached to a hand I could not see, the slow emergence of letters. YOUPICKED. The finger paused, then below it, THEWRONGRULEI turned around. Marcus was standing inside the shack between the desk and the far wall, close enough that I could see the individual hairs of his beard. He was wet, not rain wet, soaked, saturated, the kind of wet that implies total immersion. The kind that carries with it a smell of mud and mineral oil and something else I couldn't name, something organic and dark. His eyes were open and tracking, his face fully present and aware, but everything below his collarbone seemed to vibrate slightly, as though his physical form was being maintained through effort rather than existing naturally. He looked at me with an expression that mixed grief and urgency in proportions I've never seen combined on a living face. "You picked the wrong rule," he said. His voice had a subtle quality problem, slightly out of phase with his mouth movements, as though I were watching him through a medium that delayed transmission fractionally. "The first night, when the signals came on, you were supposed to reset them. I didn't know which rules to trust," I said. "That's what it counts on." He moved, Or rather, the space he occupied shifted, the distance between us changing without him taking a visible step. He was closer. Uncertainty is a door that can open. He pointed at the window. Outside, through the fog on the glass, and the headlight was visible on track 7. Farther than it had been before, maybe. But there, white and growing. You have to choose, Marcus said. Not both, not half. All the way. Which rules are right? Both. He shook his head at my expression. They're both right. They're right in different versions. You have to choose which version you want to be in. Where are you? I asked. Which version? The look he gave me then was the most purely sad expression I have ever seen on another person's face. It wasn't theatrical. It was quiet and deep and exhausted, the way grief looks when it's been carried long enough to become landscape. I'm in the one where the train stopped, he said. But I can't get out of it. I've been trying to reach you for 6 nights. He pointed again at track 7, at the headlight. That train is coming through this version, he said. Right now. It's going to pass through the shack. What do I do? Step onto the rail before it reaches you. Track 7. You have maybe 3 minutes. He looked at the desk, at the 2 rule sheets. Leave those, he said. They don't matter where you're going. I sat there for the full 60 seconds after Marcus disappeared, or dissolved or withdrew, I don't have a precise word. And I thought about Paul Guerrera. Specifically, I thought about the moment of decision, not the falsified inspection report. That particular deception had accumulated slowly, built from exhaustion and rationalization, hardened into paperwork over the course of a long shift until it barely felt like a choice at all. I mean the moment after the derailment when I had the opportunity to come forward, and the hearing was open for 6 weeks. The investigation was active. I sat on what I knew for all 6 of those weeks and said nothing, and every day of silence was a discreet, fully conscious choice, the kind that doesn't have the excuse of exhaustion or pressure behind it. Just self-preservation, just the calculation that my survival was worth more than clarity. 11 days. I had wondered many times in the 2 years since whether I was the kind of person who deserved to survive difficult situations. Not in a morbid way, just as an honest philosophical question about the relationship between character and outcome. The Caldwell terminal was apparently going to provide an empirical answer. The headlight was closed now. I could see it through the shack window without the fog obscuring it. The fog had cleared, which was in its own way more disturbing, as though the thing outside had no further need to communicate and was now in the final phase of approach. The light was white and pure and very large, casting long shadows from the signal tower posts across the gravel, and it was moving at something closer to actual train speed now. Not the slow, deliberate materialization of the earlier nights. The shack walls were vibrating. The monitors had gone static. The desk lamp swung on its hinge and pointed at the ceiling, and the whole room went tilted and wrong with the shadow. I understood sitting there that the choice in front of me wasn't really about which rule sheet to follow. Marsh had been right about that. The rules were a navigation system, not a survival guide, and the choice was about what kind of remnant I wanted to be in this fractured place. Stay inside, follow the corporate protocol, let the train pass through, and remain in this version of the yard, this side of the fracture, watching the thing come and go forever, accumulating ghosts. Or step onto track 7 and cross to the other side, to the version where the accident had already happened, where the train had already stopped, where Marcus was waiting in the specific sadness of someone who'd found the still place but couldn't leave it. Neither option was safe. Marsh had been clear about that in his way. But one option was facing it, and one option was waiting for it to finish the job. I think about Paul Guerrera, who had no choice in the final moment, who had a failed braking system and a locked cab, and 11 days afterward, I had to consider what insufficient maintenance oversight feels like from the inside of it. I picked up neither rule sheet. I left them both on the desk where they'd fallen. I opened the shack door and walked into the yard. The headlight was filling the eastern end of the terminal with white light. The ground was shaking in a constant low register. The signal tower was all green and blazing, and the light from it mixed with the headlight to create an atmosphere that felt less like illumination and more like the bleaching of everything familiar. The rails, the platforms, the shed rooftops all going pale and flattened under the combined light. I walked toward track 7, not running, walking, with the specific deliberateness of a man who has decided that the quality of the decision matters even if the outcome is uncertain. And the headlights swelled behind me. I stepped onto the rail. The train hit me the way cold water hits when you go under. That's not a metaphor. It was thermal, a massive sudden drop in temperature that moved through my body from the outside in. Not painful, but absolutely total. A full system cold that reached places heat never fully leaves. The base of the skull, the hollow of the sternum, the spaces between the vertebrae. I felt the weight of the locomotive as pressure rather than impact. The sense of something enormous passing through the space I occupied, its mass acknowledged by my nervous system as a kind of full-body compression, like the world briefly decided there wasn't enough room for both of us and then revised that assessment. Then it was gone. The cold released in stages, the warmth returning from the core outward like circulation restarting. I was standing on track 7 with my arms at my sides, and the gravel of the track bed under my boots and the yard around me was quiet. Different quiet. The first thing I noticed was the signal tower. The green lights were still on, but they had the quality of lights that had been on for a long time. A steady, stable illumination rather than the frantic signaling I'd seen before, as though they were simply describing a condition rather than issuing a warning. The second thing I noticed was the tunnel. The bulkhead was gone. The timber and metal blocking the portal entrance had been removed, or had never been there, depending on which history this version of the yard carried. The tunnel entrance stood open, and from inside it came a faint, yet residual light, the last dissipation of the headlight still warming the tunnel walls from the inside as the train completed its arrival somewhere in the dark beyond. The third thing I noticed was the maintenance shed door. It was open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the shed's interior lantern light. I walked toward him. Marcus watched me come. He didn't move from the doorway until I was close enough to see his face clearly, and then he stepped aside to let me in. He was dry. His jacket was clean, the faded rail company logo legible for the first time. Caldwell Eastern Operations. Inside the shed, the lantern on the workbench, his coffee cup, his flashlight, the specific geography of a man's claimed space. "You made it," he said. "What is this version?" He leaned against the workbench with his arms crossed. "You know, the version where the train stopped, where the accident was, final. The crew didn't make it back, but the train did." He paused. "It comes in every night, completes the last mile of the route it was on when it went into the tunnel. Then it goes back." "Goes back where?" He shook his head, not refusing to answer, just indicating that he didn't know. "And you've been here since?" "Since I stepped onto the track 6 weeks ago." He said it without particular inflection. "Following my rules, doing my job." I looked around the shed, at the lantern, the coffee cup, the flashlight, at the specific worn patch in the concrete floor where a man has stood in the same spot every night for 6 weeks waiting. "You're not trapped," I said slowly. "You just don't know how to go back." Something shifted in his expression. "In this version," he said, "there's no mechanism for going back. The seam runs in one direction." "What about me?" He looked at me for a long moment. and I understood in the quality of that look what he was about to tell me. "You came from the other side," he said. "So you're different. In this version of the yard." He picked his words carefully. "There's no Daniel Reyes assigned here, there never was. I don't exist here, not in any recorded way. I stood in the maintenance shed in a version of a train yard that had no paperwork on me, no record of my presence, no documentation of any kind connecting me to this place. In this version, I had never signed anything. I had never written, replaced, or certified on a form that wasn't true. In this version, Paul Guerrera's braking system had failed for some other reason, or perhaps hadn't failed at all, and 11 days meant nothing. The cold of the train passing through me hadn't entirely left the spaces between my vertebrae. "What do I do here?" I asked. Marcus looked at me with the expression of a man who has been alone for 6 weeks and is very carefully not showing how much that has cost him. "Same job," he said. "Watch the yard. Follow the rules." "Which rules?" He almost smiled at that. "The ones that make sense here," he said. "You'll figure them out." I still work the yard. I want to be clear about that because I think the clarity matters. This isn't a story about escape. I haven't been rescued, debriefed, committed, or released. I go to work at 11, and I leave at 7, and in between I walk the patrol route and write in the logbook and watch the monitors and wait for the nightly event that has become, after enough repetitions, something I can only call routine. The rules here are different from both sheets I left on the desk in the other world. Rule 1. Never leave track 7 after midnight. The track is the seam. The seam is the only stable geography in the yard after dark, when the ambient residue of the accident concentrates in the rail lines and everything else becomes uncertain. I learned this through 3 nights of methodical testing that I won't fully describe except to say that the maintenance shed corridor after midnight no longer connects to the same locations on exit and entry. Rule 2. If you hear a train horn, step onto the rail. Standing on track 7 when the train completes its nightly route anchors you to this version. The horn is a timing signal, not a warning. I misunderstood that for the first 2 weeks and spent those nights crouched behind the signal tower base, with my heart doing things hearts shouldn't do for extended periods. Rule 3. If you see another watchman inside the security office, do not approach them. This one took me the longest to understand, and understanding it was the single most disorienting experience of the year I've spent here, which is a significant distinction given the competition. The shack lights go on sometimes, not always, not on a schedule I've been able to predict, but regularly enough that I know to look for it when the fog sits low over the yard, when the ambient wrongness of the place is at its thickest. The lights inside the shack come on, and in through the window, the same window I pressed my hand to during the cold open of this account. I can see the interior of the office illuminated in the yellow glow of the desk lamp. And at the desk, a man. He's reading a paper. 2 sheets of it, laid side by side on the desk surface, were smoothed flat with a hand. I know what those sheets say. I know them by heart, both versions, every word. I left them there in that other world, and they stayed there because things that belong to that side of the fracture can't cross to this one. I've watched him read them many times now. He leans close. He looks from one sheet to the other. I can see his face in partial profile when he turns toward the window. And his face is mine. And the expression on it is the expression of a man who is working very hard to find a logical framework inside a situation that has already exceeded the reach of logic. He's trying to decide which rules to follow. Every time he reaches that decision point, every time I watch his body language shift from reading to deciding, I hear the horn from the sealed tunnel in his world. The train is preparing to make its approach. The moment when his rules and my rules and the question of which reality persists will all converge on a single choice. And every night he decides. And every night, depending on what he decides, one of two things happens. If he stays inside, the train passes through his version of the world, and he remains in it. Yun and I watch his silhouette sit very still at the desk while the windows rattle and the signal lights paint his face in red and yellow and green. He survives that night. He'll face the same choice tomorrow. If he steps onto the track, if he follows the handwritten rules, then the shack lights go out and the yard on my side goes very quiet, and I wait. Sometimes, a few minutes later, I hear footsteps on the gravel behind me, and someone is standing at the edge of track 7 looking at me, looking at where I'm standing, on the seam between versions. And they're wearing my face, and I don't know which of us is the original. I keep meaning to ask Marcus about this. He's been here longer. He's had more time to develop a philosophy about it. But every time I start to form the question, I realize I don't want to hear the answer. And I find something else to occupy my attention. The logbook, the monitors, the nightly arrival of the train from its tunnel, completing a route that ended 23 years ago with 30 men who never made it out. I think about Paul Guerrera sometimes in this version of the yard. I think about whether the version of me that's still in that shack, reading the rules, deciding, choosing, is the one who's paying the debt, or the one who ran from it. I think about how they might not be different things. I think about how a fracture in sequential time, anchored at the point of a catastrophic mistake, might be a reasonable metaphor for the way guilt actually works. Not linear, not resolved, endlessly recursive, the same moment approached from every direction simultaneously. The signal lights come on. Green, tonight. Just green, and the horn sounds from the direction of the open tunnel. I step onto track 7 and I stand on the seam, and I wait for the train to arrive and complete its route, the way it has every night for 23 years, the way it will every night for however long I remain here. Through the shack window, the lights are on. He's reading, deciding, and somewhere in the sealed tunnel of the other world, the brakes are already failing. End of record. D. Reyes, Caldwell Terminal Night Supervisor, date of filing, unknown.